Okay, looking at this, first of all, you have to say it's a real good painting, but where could you say that this setting was? I could make a lot of things out of this and use this picture in a lot of ways that we were looking at in some stories that we did recently. But all of them would be older time. In fact, most of my videos are about much older time, or mythical ideas. So you look at this and you could say this was one of these Proto-Indo-Europeans that we've been talking about, and she's got red carbuncle and the belt and everything. That might make sense. That might even be that one that was found with the marijuana or hemp and in that burial from a long time ago, and her rituals that she would go through, although you'd probably think she was holding a bowl. I could tell you this is somebody letting loose a Luna moth and go off about butterflies, but that really needs its own separate video in itself. I could tell you that this is people around the Black Sea and worshiping the moon at certain times of the seasons, and it's actually the moon, first moon, after the rites of spring, and you can see all the flowers starting to spring up. Ta-da. And so she lets loose a butterfly. Well, but this could also be somewhere from Black Sea, Balkans type area, all the way through Europe. You could say this goes along with maidens. They're around the time of King Arthur, in fact. Or if I was to put this in a D&D context, I would probably say that she's a wood elf. But we've talked about elves and how that would go and where that would come along into it. But I could tell you this story that would go along with all three, that would really be where this girl was eventually buried at, for it was a place that they had found whenever they came to build their little woodland village that's just rotted away so long ago and then swallowed up by the trees. You'd never know it existed. But in her time, she came up here picking berries and things, and found ancient artifacts and knew that we had been here but long before. Yeah, flint work and things like that, and so they knew, so they made it somewhat of a sacred hill. And here she is going through a ritual doing that. But when she passed away, they buried her right over there on the right, and that's where we found her at, in that Proto-Indo-European burial. And it could be the same thing. For this cedar forest could be over there in far Russia, what we call today. Or it could be somewhere around the Black Sea area, the Balkans, and all the way through Europe. But also this could be somebody from ancient Anatolian area very easily, for there had the cedar forest and things like that. You know, cedars reached down during the last ice age much lower than they are now. Just like there's a tree line on mountains and so on due to weathering and everything, and that's an evergreen, it can handle it. And yeah, it was, anyhow, I talk about that and a bunch of my other stuff. This could go along with a lot of things, and man, I could go off for an hour. Let's just go ahead and get into this concept we're going to talk about here. For what this is the return of paganism, the return of ancient gods, the resurgence in paganism. Over the past 2 centuries, Europe has become increasingly secular. Scholars, in fact, no longer talk of the Christian West when they speak of modern Europe and North America, but of the secular West. There is, however, evidence of a spiritual revival stirring on the continent where God is supposedly dead. It's kind of a weird opening statement, for it's really, we still understand America, of course, in the West to be very Christian and still have a biblical concept going on to it, but there's a lot of resurgent in old traditions, and let's talk about that. Old traditions predating the appearance of the Jewish carpenter turned Messiah are beginning to re-emerge. Since the 19th century, there has been an increasing interest in ancient pre-Christian European religions such as ancient Greek, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic paganism. This stems from an increasing interest in spirituality in Europe, specifically a spiritual in touch with European heritage and ethnic roots in a similar manner to indigenous religions of, say, Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians, where they're having that deal, the rituals and so on, and going and trying to, grab their roots kind of concept and going to the way back. Well, all these different people have somewhat of connections too in a very early time in a kind of mixed up way if you've been paying attention to my videos and where certain people came from. We'll get into that a little bit more here in just a minute. But let's talk about this trend, this ancient and modern combined trend. Among modern pagans, there are two approaches to reviving pagan practices. One is eclecticism or syncretism, in which elements of historical, ethnic, religious, such as the ancient Norse religion, are combined with modern movements such as Wicca and Theosophy or New Age philosophies. This is largely based on Romantic views of these ancient religions, which emerged in the 19th century, which may or may not be historically accurate. And what comes to mind whenever I say that is like people doing Druidic rituals right now and so on, and you look at it all and you think, well, you probably don't have all of that quite right, but you're going through the motions at least, right? But there's some big missing spots in all of that. In Iceland, the Norse gods are making a particularly strong comeback, and Nordic paganism is now Iceland's fastest growing religion. In fact, they will soon complete the first temple to Thor and Odin to exist in Iceland in over 1,000 years. I don't believe anyone believes in a one-eyed man who is riding about on a horse with 8 feet. High Priest Hilmar Orn Hilmarsson told The Guardian. We see the stories as poetic metaphors and a manifestation of the forces of nature and human psychology. Well, indeed, that kind of is where it comes out of and spurns in mythology, spurns from that, of course. And people have realized this now, but whenever they wrote the stories about it, you'd have to realize that they were also aware of it too, and that there was perhaps like a second layer to the knowledge and the esoteric teachings that usually went along with this. And he says he doesn't believe anybody believed in a one-eyed man riding about on a horse with 8 feet. Well, it went as fast as 2 horses, or you have a 2-horse pulled chariot going on in situations like this that goes on, and a one-eyed man's extremely possible. The stories that they all bulk upon it, though, seem to be in something that's ancestor worship and veneration. From an extreme old time to more modern times gets thrown on him over and over again, somewhat like people have done in the King Arthur mode, where I tell you that pulling a sword out of a stone has got a lot more to do with smithing than it does with a kid coming along and yanking it up that was a squire for somebody else. A different story. Denmark too completed a pagan temple dedicated to Odin for the first time in a millennium in 2016. And so here we see a representation of a modern day pagan celebration, it says. And that's the thing that I was talking about before, where even though you see some people dressed in garb and going through the situation, do they even really have a clue about the reality of it all? Or do they, in fact, are they all steeped up with a whole bunch of BS that's come from others and mixed all together and da da da, and they try to pull off something from that which really isn't authentic in any way? That's what the guy's talking about. Wouldn't be much long ago that, of course, this would have to have been devil worship, of course, because here we have a pentagram on the ground starting with a fire that goes into a pyramid shape. Weird thing about this type of shape here that goes on, though, man, if you simply were able to take and measure this line as it goes here, this bisecting point is at the golden measure. Yeah, the golden ratio and things, but also it ends up going with, strangely, like a spirograph I keep telling you about whenever I was a kid, where you had these weird dials with little holes in them, and you'd put your pin in that and spin it around in this ring, and it would make designs and colors and eventually look like a flower and stuff. Well, you can make a whole flower of life and everything else, but what you could do was make this too. But then if you kept going, it would put another one just to the right of it and just to the right of that. And I remember taking my sister's multicolored pen, where you could get 5 different colors out of it, and going through each one and making like a little rainbow, and we went around and around and around. It was real cool. But what that also goes with is the clockwork of the heavens and Venus, for it takes 8 years to go through it. But as it does, Venus goes through a cycle where, if you were watching it, let's just give it a starting point of here. If you're watching it, would have gone boing, 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 and then end up back here and do it again and do it again. Due to precession and things and the way it works. So people wonder why you connect it with it and why it does and everything. And it seems like it connected from astrology from way back when. I could go off, but let's leave that alone for a second. Reconstructing the past. The other approach is a polytheistic reconstructionism, which is an attempt to make an historically accurate reconstruction of these ancient religions based on historical sources, archaeological data, and perhaps ethnographic comparison. Reconstructionists avoid embellishing ancient pagan religions with modern movements and ideologies. So that would be people that are trying to, worship the Greek gods and none of that BS. And they'd be like, well, she does this and that. And you go, no, 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 no. That's a more modern thing. Like people that play D&D and they try to play out these characters and stuff, they would be, and the DM especially would be like Zeus and tell them, no, 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 no. It goes more like this, that wouldn't be part of that. It's more like this. Read this. It kind of hints at it there, so more like that. But of course, you'd have to leave out modern interpretations. People in a modern day in the Christian world try to pull all the modern things into the Bible and say, well, it still goes, even though all that stuff was apparently a little wrong and there aren't demons in people and stuff. It's actually germs. But, and the world and the cosmos isn't centered around us, even though people died for figuring it out, and it works a whole different way. Still, it's all in effect in a way. Well, and I always think of it as a culmination of what's happened anyhow. For if you looked at some of my videos, I show where all this stuff comes from, and a lot of it's in the Bible. But whenever they take the symbology out of it and they take the idols out of it, you can't see what it really used to be attached to. But it's pretty easy to come back through it and figure out where that came from. So let's look at a couple of these. There's this Germanic paganism. One of the largest movements currently, which can be either syncretic or reconstructionist, is the revival of Germanic paganism or heathenry. Of course, pagan is a bad word and heathen is a bad word, of course, with what happened and everything. Think of it a different way, but just as far as, well, it's not that exact religion, but it's the stuff that was there before. Let's just go with that. Modern Germanic pagans, or heathens, as they prefer to call themselves, worship the old Germanic gods, especially Thor and Odin, as well as Germanic nature spirits such as elves and trolls. Germanic heathens appear to be have three different approaches to proselytizing and practicing their religion. So here we have stories of elves and things like that. Hopefully you've seen my recent videos where I talk about it, and some of you even aren't that recent, but where how it's weird, but as they became part of Europe, they ended up making a mythology about themselves, and how together with you they ended up kicking their ass. And that happens a couple of times too, to where it comes out to be the fairies and the elves and the pixies, which are pixies. And we've talked about the elves and what goes with El and the people of ancient Anatolia and through that area in the Black Sea. And again, the Tuatha De Danann. Now they hook with the tribe of Dan, and so on. But they have about three different approaches, he's saying here. Some heathens emphasize simply the worship of the Germanic gods and believe that anyone, regardless of their national, ethnic, or racial backgrounds, can worship the gods. These are called universalists. And I guess you'd say in a modern day, Christianity's really that way. In fact, a lot of religions are somewhat that way, but really the Abrahamic religions are known to be that way. For you can do this with Islam, due to their conquest and the way they felt about that, and of course Christianity in its way too. And of course Christianity tries to be a whole accepting type of thing now, but it stems of course out of the Abrahamic religions and the Old Testament and everything. It's only about Caucasians and their area, and starting out in Sumer and the Fertile Crescent and everything about that, even containing Egypt, which was always Caucasians, even blue-eyed ones. Look up my videos on it and it shows it. Anyhow, endemic North Africans and so on, that went on for well over 30,000 years. But that's a universalist look at it, where like, even though you're not mentioned really, you're contained in it. Only certain people are real jealous of that fact and things. Other people have their own religions, and I'm a firm believer in that India, when you study it, that's just unique and neat, and nobody would want that to go away and lose its flavor and turn into vanilla. Vanilla's fantastic, but everybody should keep their own thing going. Where Buddhism went, but we've talked about Buddha and Gautama Buddha and where that comes from. Anyhow, where Buddhism and things like that went, and separatism. When I was a kid, my dad loved Westerns and everything, but he also had a great respect for Indians, and we went and checked out different Indian tribes and stuff like that when we ran around. It was one way that we got to see the U.S. and do different things. And looking back on it, no, we didn't go to Disney World and this, that, and the other, but well, we did go to SeaWorld, and that got me into that, and shortly after I saw Jaws. But it's not about me. Let's continue with this. Thor and Odin and Germanic types. For really, there seems to be a double or two forms of that Germanic type, if you will, and but it's still kept in together as one, where an earlier Germanic type had of course come through, we were talking about earlier, but then later the people noticed the Huns went through there, and if you look at that, that was Germans, and we've talked about that in a recent video. Here's a neat little depiction of Odin, except for Odin's riding on a horse, but the horse has a cowling on his head that turns him into a unicorn, even though he isn't. And he has the two ravens that are near him, but those ravens look a little more gray instead of being the ravens that are usually with him. And then we have Thor. And then we have Freya, which somewhat has a Mercury type concept to him. In fact, I've got a different type of transmog for in my D&D game where a paladin looks very much like this. And there used to be one with the wings turned up a little more for the fighter, the sword fighter, great weapons fighter. In this depiction, I guess Thor's redheaded as opposed to being blonde, more like his Odin would be, and of course Freya and so on too, but it's okay, I guess that fits good. Oh, here's something weird for you. Here we have Woden, Thor, and Freya. Here we have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So if you think all of this is gone, well, every week you are still containing, worshiping, if you will, these things that go on or went on, Woden, Thor, and Freya. There are other heathens, however, who believe that Germanic cultural and spiritual values are also need to be adopted in order to be true worshippers of the Germanic gods. Most of the latter group of the heathens also believe that worship of the Germanic gods is not limited to any particular ethnic or racial background, simply that those individuals interested in worshiping them should learn something about and agree with some aspects of the culture from which they originated. Not themselves, but the Germanic people and their concept. Germanic paganism is, after all, technically an ethnic religion. There are some heathens, however, who call themselves focused heathens, who believe that not only those who are of white Northern European descent have any right to worship their gods. This is kind of like, well, this is where it came from. And I guess Christianity has that to some degree, but again, as we just spoke about, they have that all-encompassing, and yeah, Jesus loves all the colors of the world and everything. Yeah. But it was really all a religion that went on with these people, and it's their plight that ran through. Just like India, again, has their own thing, and it doesn't mention Orientals or Amerindians in it either, but let's just continue. There are people that are purists for that, and there are people that are purists for every religion to go in there. And like whenever you tried to, I watched a thing about Kung Fu, the old show Kung Fu, and not too long ago, and how he was a half-bred kid, and how they weren't really accepted in even the master there told him, told him that, was it Poe? Yeah, told him that if you're not their ethnicity, you're not allowed in this temple usually. And he goes through this whole thing, and then he says, well, but there are always exceptions to rules. And he could realize he was shattering the kid by telling him that in the first place. So one can probably understand these concepts. These are the ones, though, that tend to promote white supremacism, they say, and of course they're going to go off on that, and other explicitly racist agendas. Other heathens, as a result, try to distance themselves from focused, even though those who would otherwise agree that heathens who worship the Germanic gods should adopt Germanic values. So, understand it, but don't freak out. Don't make it a cult thing. Well, you can understand that, especially after World War II and the dogma that's ended up continually propagated out of that in everything. And another thing I watched recently was a deal about Indiana Jones and the making of these movies, and it's just all about hating Nazis. Well, Spielberg and them, of course, are Jewish and stuff and everything, and of course, in our values, we can recently go against Orientals because of World War II and Pearl Harbor and all that, or you could say that it was Germans and everything, and everybody understands the German one, but that's really run its gamut long ago, in my mind, and pretty much theirs too, probably, but they love the propaganda pull-up of it. But at the same time, it's really pretty much run its gambit. But when we're trying to show something about a time of Indiana Jones, it would have been in your face. And so they utilize that. I agree with it totally, but I also see the other side of the coin, as I'm saying. Of course, they say, well, if it's about Germans and German, then that's got to be, it's racist and it's this, that, and the other. No, it's not. It's like if somebody said India, 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 or Taiwan, no, we're not gonna go there and just attack the heralds of civilization, are we? And this white superiority thing could go a definitely different way, but it's amazing that Caucasian people have helped out all walks of life. We've realized that some should be actually left alone after experiencing things, but nobody wants to go into that. So there's different types of Germanic paganism, and you can imagine how it would get attacked very easily. Let's just say that. Slavic paganism, which is really not much different, but Slavic paganism or heathenism also enjoyed a resurgence in Eastern Europe and countries with large Slavic populations. A movement known as Rodnovery, or native faith, is made up of communities which claim to continue the ancient Slavic religion, which was mostly replaced by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This movement is especially strong in Poland, despite the nation's dominant Catholic identity. Many Rodnovery are self-described Reconstructionists, but others claim direct continuity with the ancient traditions, claiming that their families continued their old religion in secret or in cloaked form alongside Christianity. Well, there's a lot of that had to happen, I guess, back and forth, and especially through what we know about the Dark Ages. Let's just say that. But, well, let's just say that and leave that missing spot out just for a second. Revival of the Greek gods, though. So this is going back where in Greece, a couple of organizations have emerged promoting a revival of the ancient Greek religion under the name Hellenism. The Hellenists also call themselves dodecatheists, or the believers in 12 gods, well, dodecahedrons, like the 12-sided dice, namely the Olympian deities, and of course the Council of 12 and its sacred numbers, and that goes with sacred geometry and all these things, measurements. That carries back to the Sumerians. But religious practices in Hellenism include public worship at temples or in outdoor open spaces of the major Greek gods: Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, Hera, and Athena, Ares, and Aphrodite, Demeter, Hephaestus, Hermes, Hestia, Dionysus, Hades, and Poseidon, among others. There's also a large household worship component centered on domestic Greek deities such as Hestia, goddess of the hearth. We talked about that recently with Venus symbology and how far that goes back. Most Hellenists are politically inactive, but some of them desire to create a nation and ethnic identity for Greece not rooted in Eastern Orthodoxy. Some Hellenists have been vocally hostile towards the Greek Orthodoxy Church, but many simply want to practice their religion amicably alongside Greek Christians. The problem comes about that whenever you go into the Greek thing, and if you're really going to take it on full, there are so many festivals and things like that and da-da-da that goes out through the years, and you can think about all these things that they would be doing in the open for each one of these gods, that it's, I guess in a modern day, you would have to think of it as being intrusive. Right? So here would be the council of gods, if you will, of the Greeks. Poseidon riding a horse. It was trident. Neptune, what's up with that? Well, seahorse, he's the god of horses. Yeah, if you've watched my old videos, I got tired of, I'm known as Neptune, so why run that into the ground? But yeah, it hooks up with horses. But then you find about how his age and how long he goes back and this, so that makes connections that go way back. Well, that's Olympus gods. But there's also a return to Celtic paganism. In addition to the revival of Greek, Germanic, and Slavic forms of paganisms, or the old ways, there's also an attempt to revive Celtic paganism. There are both Reconstructionist, modern Celtic pagans, and syncretic modern Celtic pagans who also incorporate Wicca and other traditions into their religion. Now, modern Celtic pagans use the lunar calendar of the ancient Celts and celebrate the solstices and equinoxes as well as the cross quarter days, days that are halfway between one of the solstices and one of the equinoxes. This goes with Beltane and all those type of things. We talked about that. This extra with Samhain and Halloween's festivals that's coming up, but it's actually the seasons of the year and the cycles of everything, and it's not about devil worshiping at all. I did a separate one about Samhain and so on, though, but mythology that goes along with that. So they include well-known festivals such as Samhain or Imbolc. There does not appear to have been any attempt to connect contemporary Celtic paganism to a political agenda or nationalist movement, unlike the other forms of contemporary paganism. No, they just want to be left alone. There's a lot of my people watch the videos that are from the UK and Europe over in this area here, so you're probably experiencing this a lot more than gets pushed out that we get to know about. Let me know about it in the comments down there. But I've seen the Burning Man, the Wicca Man, the big old guy that they build up and everything, do it each year in that harbor. They do it every year and stuff. It's got to be huge. It's incredible. And that's just showing a good showing of people that are back to celebrating this type of ritual. Well, eventually at one time, 4th of July and fireworks are going to be some type of ritual, and different things else turns to be some type of ritual. Thanksgiving isn't going to be looked at that way because it's families getting together, and that's what it's really based around in the first place, and trying to have a coming together. But let's continue. So here we're looking at that ancient ritual spring that they have here, and the flowers. Notice that they're purple flowers, which is kind of rare, like a freesia flower. Well, the Frisian people and everything. Well, up there you go a little part of the nest and you'll freeze. Celtic type people that are painted up somewhat like Clan of the Caber. Were they painted up like this all the time? No, but then the Celts and their pics are something different. And they don't mix it all together. But then there are people here next to it. I don't know. There's some girl looks like she's green, but there's a bluish light on everybody, and they're just all revering up on what's going on here. It's the rites of spring, though, pretty much, right? That's Beltane. The past meets the future. Religions tend to shape civilizations. When Europe became Christian and the Middle East and North Africa became Muslim, two different civilizations were formed, which were quite different because of the religious traditions on which they were based. Well, yeah, but they're both from an Abrahamic situation out of that, but one came far after the other, and let's not get into that. Europe most likely won't become pagan again, but it is interesting to think of what sort of civilization would be birthed from the revival of one of these ancient religious traditions. What would a modern pagan Greece look like culturally and politically? For example, one thing is for certain, it would go in a rather different direction than either a Christian or secular Greece. Well, I agree with that. That instantly makes me think of back college and stuff and toga parties. We're back in the age of not long after Animal House came out and all those type of things, and people doing that type of thing and stuff, and a revival then. But of course, that the dormitories that they were going to were all Phi Kappa Delta and things, and that goes along with the ancient Greeks. That's Greek in itself, Alpha and Omega itself. So how do y'all feel about people doing this? To me, I don't shun from it, I would say, but it's something that I feel like we've gotten past a little bit. Not to sound weird and modernistic to anybody, even though I study all these ancient cultures, it's beautiful to see what blossomed out of it all. And what's really amazing is what's happened in this last little bit where we've took and stepped it up to a notch that's so far past this, the science, that now we can look back at it in a way, and even things from just generations ago become a kind of mythology before we really had it going on. And of course, that's going to be happening for every couple of generations, rippling on through time for thousands of years here because of the advancements that are happening. And if you think about what your granddad thought about it, like I talk about sometimes, how he remembers the first cars showing up and transistor radio and telephone showing up and TV. And he saw people go to the moon and computers in his lifetime. Take a generation away from him back. It really wasn't much different from the Roman times, but there were little advances through there. Well, you got to say the Industrial Revolution, but if you step just from the edge of that back, we have to go back to, Copernicus leading through Newton and all the things that came from there, and the Greeks that led us on from there, and so on and so on. But then again, when we study a lot of that, it goes back a lot further, and the knowledge that they had at the time goes back much further. And we've talked about that recently too. But, Jesus said he'd be with us for a generation in the Bible there. And in one of the interpretations of that, in the Septuagint, that word actually comes out to being a zodiacal. He says he'll be with us for an age. And that term is the same term they use for zodiacal age. Let's just say it that way. And that was the hearkening of Pisces. And that's the reason the fish symbology, and he does it at a wedding and everything else that goes along with it. But now we've reached the age of Aquarius. And really, if you look at it, as we reach the cusp or the dawning of the age of Aquarius, even in that song that was in the 60s, there was a great change that's come through, and we've reached into a modern age and a space age. And it's hard to take all of this and put it all together and make one and even get a good religion out of it that people can have extreme belief in. Well, if you realize the Bible is actually a conglomerate of what had gone on and points it all in one point, as opposed to them all having pantheons. Even Elohim is plural. I don't want to or need to go there, but its origins before that point are all from things that had pantheons that went with things. Back in a time when people were more like elves and in tune with nature. For those wood elves who were talking about began way back when, what was special about them? Well, they were tuned in nature and do all this stuff, right? And you know about it, yeah? Well, that's because they didn't really use stonework. They built everything out of wood. Yeah. There was places which built out of straw, like Samaria and stuff, and then there were places that built out of wood and places that ended up building out of stone. It's kind of Three Little Pigs. Kind of goes with that. I ought to do a video on that. Three Little Pigs and reality compared to mythology. Do a dissertation on that. You're like, what the hell? Well, he huffed and he puffed. Anyhow, what do y'all think about revival in these religions? I think it's okay, and I think whenever they go to Stonehenge and do their deal, that's a cool deal. They only realized not too long ago that they would have made this processional walk and do all these things. And some of the guys involved with it go, yes, this is definitely what they would have done. But do they need to be purist? Do they need to take the essence of it? Do they need to just give respect to that? Giving respect to that, is that worshiping it really? Or is it just a veneration for things that had come before? Because that was a veneration from things that had come before that, as we've shown. And that was a veneration and reaching back to a things that had happened before. And just like that girl found that mound to be sacred because people like us a long time ago, we had been here, was a veneration of a spot from long, long before. Like, share, subscribe, and enjoy. We'll get on to another concept. Let me know what y'all think in the comments. Peace.